Skorseth, and this is Robin Hensel. And we have a couple of guests I'll introduce in a moment, but first I want to tell you this is not an episode of Can We Talk? It's a standalone program because everyone here is very interested in the question of church and state. So we're calling it Church and State, the Local View. Our guests are Herb Davis and Retha Dooley. And we all come from a different place spiritually, so we're going to, or in terms of religion, I should say. So we're going to just go around the table and everybody can give a little statement about where they stand on the issue of religion. If you'd start, Herb.
Well, I'm Herb Davis, born and baptized Catholic, avid altar boy, Catholic student, went to Catholic high school, started at a Catholic college, didn't finish. Someplace around age 7 or 8, I began to question the existence of God, and sometime around age 13, 14, 15, became convinced that there was no evidence for the existence of a God, but I didn't have and still don't really have a problem with anybody that believes that there is such a thing as a God or a creator or higher power or any name you'd like to give it. So I don't know if that introduces me enough.
Would you call yourself an atheist?
I call myself a lot of things. I don't like being called an atheist. But certainly I'm a gopher, or a boogeyman, or a Santa Claus. I don't believe in a lot of things that don't have evidence.
Right.
But yeah, you can call me an atheist, that won't bother me, but I want to make the point that just because I don't believe in all the gods that you do, you may only believe in one, for all I know. I don't believe in that one. That doesn't define who I am.
Okay, good. And Retha, where do you stand?
Well, where I stand, I'll just give you a little history. My parents really were a-religious, if you will. My father was born and raised Catholic and left home at quite an early age and left that religion behind him. When he met my mother and the 4 of us were born, he very clearly stated he did not want to force any religion on us, and that at some point in our lives, if we decided we wanted to become religious, we could do that on our own. So I had kind of a unique situation where I had Catholic neighbors, and the next neighbor to them, they were Lutheran. So I would often go to Catholic Mass or to catechism sometimes with the girls, or I would go to Zion Lutheran Church in Anoka. So that was kind of how I grew up, and then, I was in my 30s when I decided that I needed and or wanted a larger faith community, and because of the political climate of the time, there was so much happening in Central America. The priests and nuns were doing such great peace and justice work that I decided that I wanted to become a part of that group. So I became a Catholic in my early 30s, and most of my friends would say things like, wow, why would a woman become a Catholic given the church's history with regard to women? And I would say, well, I'm a drunk, I'm Irish, I thought I might as well be Catholic too, But more seriously, I really did, the people I knew in the Catholic Church were the nuns and priests who were putting themselves on the line and were dying for peace and justice. And those were the people that I spent time with. Since that time, I have walked way back from the established Catholic Church, and I don't know what I would say. I guess I would practice what I consider an eclectic view of spirituality. And I do believe in a universal power, a universal love. I believe that love is the answer to the questions that we have.
Whatever the question might be.
Exactly. So that's where I'm at.
Good. Robin, let's hear from you, and then I'll add my 2 cents.
Well, I was confirmed a Methodist in the town I grew up in, and my parents took us to Methodist church until I was in about 7th or 8th grade, and then they stopped insisting that we go. I was, like I said, I was confirmed a Methodist. My grandmother had more of a spiritual influence on me than anyone in my whole life. She came from the Netherlands and came from a large family. My grandpa on my mom's side was German, and they had both experienced religious pressure, I think, in their countries of origin. On my father's side, there's some history of the Huguenots in France, and I know there was tension. My grandpa Sid immigrated from Vancouver. He came from Plymouth, England to Vancouver, Canada, and there was persecution in France and England to do with, there's all kinds of church conflict in my ancestry. I didn't study much about that, and that really didn't influence my decisions about God in my life. But after confirmation, I didn't attend church very often. My parents moved from the close proximity to my grandparents when I was in 10th grade, just entering 10th grade. And then I didn't get to see my grandma and grandpa very often after that. And they were really close to me. They had exampled, they were probably the most pristine example for me of how to hold a relationship together. And I'm saying that now in relation to, I'm getting sidetracked here a little bit, but it ties in. One of the best books I read on relationships between a man and a woman, or whatever, but it was a book called How to Best Save Your Second Marriage Before It Begins, and it talks about the glue that holds people together is having a common interest, or 2 or 3. If you don't have that, those relationships generally don't last, and boy, did my grandparents example that. Their 2 common interests were the church, and sticking by the church through the thick and the thin, and politics. They were staunch Democrats, and they raised me to believe that when you are having someone at your house, you host them well, you feed them a decent meal, you give them all the beverage that they want, and you serve people. My grandma took me particularly along when she would go to Ladies' Aid at the Methodist Church, and taught me that serving in that way, being a part of church service, was very important. And then I went to college, graduated, went to college, moved away from home, moved back, started a business, and got married, had kids, and at age 31 I gave my heart to Christ publicly in a Good News Assembly of God in St. Cloud, matter of fact, an Assembly of God church. And prior to that, I had been really interested in a public affirmation of Christ. And leading up to my decision to give my heart totally to Christ, there were a bunch of things that happened that were what I would consider miracles. I'm not going to go into them now because there's not time to talk about all that. But I was convinced that I needed to stop playing games with God and acknowledge that He was real in my life and just begin to give Him as much attention in my life as I would, like you're sitting here, and you're sitting here, and you're sitting here. That I was going to consider Him that real in my life. And I remember the evening of after I gave my heart to Christ publicly, and what that meant was I went forward in an altar call and asked forgiveness for my sins and asked Him to guide me for my life, I guess, basically in a nutshell. And that night under the stars out by my goat pasture, I had 2 goats and a whole bunch of chickens and ducks and geese. I said an audible prayer outdoors, acknowledging that he was real and thanking him for being that real to me. And later, because of the politics in the country at that time and some of what the people at the church that I was attending were doing with their politics and with their money and with their investments, I decided to take a step back from all of that and examine what was the difference in my Methodist heritage as opposed to my public conversion to what I now know is a very conservative church. If you are a liberal thinking person, a free thinker in a conservative church, you don't fit. And I quickly found that out. It was the music that drew me to the church. It was the music that drew my heart to want to have a personal relationship with Christ.
So it sounds as if you and Retha both kind of came into religion from a social justice angle, in different ways.
I did, because for my grandparents, who were the prime examples for me of Christianity as I was growing up, they had an extreme connection to both, to the church and to politics. And I don't mean that they were extreme in their views, but they were dedicated. They were methodical in both. And the word Methodist actually, methodical is tied in with that. Well, it was at about the time when apartheid was really strong in Africa that I made this conversion. And my Methodist pastor from the location close to where we lived had gone to the consulate in Washington, D.C., and knocked on the door of South Africa consulate and became arrested for questioning. Just the knocking itself got him arrested, and he was jailed in the Washington, D.C. jail that night. And he told us in church of that experience. The other pastor at the St. Cloud Good News Assembly of God was, I don't know if he was aware or not, but we had some church folks come to us and ask if we wanted to invest some of our money in South Africa because it was pulling like 30% interest. And I was astonished, taken aback, and so I started to study about this whole anti-apartheid movement. And because Dr. Raleigh Robinson, who was that pastor who got arrested, was probably the best pastor I've ever had in my whole life. And he was willing to do that great act of question that. He said to me, Robin, if the Assembly of God church you're going to, if those missionaries from the Assembly of God in South Africa, ask your pastor if they're living in whites only area or the mixed areas or right in the black areas. So I called a luncheon between those two. And I remember what I served that day, and I remember the conversations that we had. Of course, the Assembly of God pastor and his wife were living in a whites-only area, and that bothered me. It was a short time after that, in that church, a very close friend of mine whose son was ministering in a church ministry, and she had been in an abusive relationship and was falling on economic hard times, got zero help from this Assembly of God church. And I was listening to Christian radio, and one of the things I heard was that if your church that you are giving your tithe to or your offerings, whatever, if they're not meeting the social needs of the people that are attending your church, move your money elsewhere. So I did that. I then shifted not only my money that I was giving to church, but my physical attendance to the Salvation Army Church in St. Cloud. I became a soldier. My husband at the time joined and became a soldier as well. In fact, a few years after that, I considered becoming an officer and dedicating my life totally to the ministry. But your spouse has to be on board with that 100%, and he was a law officer at the time and not interested. But that intrigued me. And interesting, in the Salvation Army, if you're going to become an officer, so you're going to become like a pastor, you have to give everything you own to the church. Same as in the Catholic Church, to become a priest or a nun, you have to donate everything you have, 100%. You have to trust totally. And your children are sent to a school, their headquarters are in Illinois, somewhere in Illinois. And you have to have your kids go to this academy as well. And it was just too big of a step, and we were in the process of considering adoption, and a lot of other things were going on, so we never went that route. But I never moved my membership from there, so technically I'm still a soldier in the Salvation Army, but I don't attend now because it's a distance from here. But also, later on, I found out that the Salvation Army takes a strong stance against, you can be an alcoholic or a prostitute or a gay or any of the other quote-unquote called sinner type, you can come and you can worship and they'll welcome you in, but you cannot become an officer or a soldier if you don't step away from those former sins. And so I didn't attend anymore, and I disagree with that stance. I think Christ welcomed everyone into church, and I think it's wrong to not do that. And then I'm gonna stop right here, and then there's a portion I'm not gonna talk about right now until later, which involves from that point until about 5 years ago. And about, I wanna say 2 years ago, I became a licensed minister with a Universal Life Church. And it is because they have as two things for their motto, or their creed, or whatever you call it. You have to believe in doing that, only that which is right, and believe in the Constitution of the United States. And I can thoroughly agree with that. And I can still keep my faith in Christ and have that licensure status. And what led up to that decision, and along the way after I came to this town, there was a whole bunch of things in the last 6 years that changed my opinion on the church, and I'll stop right there.
Are you sure?
Is that long enough?
Oh my.
It's very interesting, thank you.
Very. Yes, you've had a long and storied history. My history, and I'll make it short, is I was personally converted at 9, but it had nothing to do with church. I just found I had a spiritual experience and found myself changed. At 21, also in an Assembly of God church, I gave my life to Christ. I answered the altar call and did all of that. I left the church 5 or 6 years later because they were such sexist jerks. I couldn't handle it. And they were always trying to make me submit, and of course that didn't work. It was doomed. So I left the church, but I did not leave my spirituality. I did not leave my belief in Jesus as my Savior and the efficacy of the crucifixion and the resurrection, and so on. But I have a big problem with church. Every time I try to make myself at home in a church, I find I'm not wanted. And because I won't change my character to suit everyone else's preference. So there we go. That's it in a nutshell. There are, of course, lots of details that go into that, but we don't really need all those details. If we're going to have time to get to the question at hand, which is the church and the state, and whether or not the church should have any influence on government, and if so, how much. And I think we just need to go around the table and have a stab at that. What do you think, Herb?
Well, I'll go fourth. What do you think, Robin?
Okay.
Well, I think the church should not have a tax exemption status. And I say that because that, in my opinion, completely stifles the church from speaking out about what should never be considered political ideas or political agenda or anything like that. What I'm talking about is there are certain things, I think, in this world that are personally deep, and I don't know that we should make laws pertaining to those things except without deep thought in spirituality before we implement those laws. I don't know where the dividing line is. I don't know who decides what's political and what's spiritual. You know, there's that old slogan, you never talk about politics or religion with friends or at the dinner table. Well, then where do we talk about it? How do we decide? Who helps us navigate those issues?
Right.
If it isn't the church's responsibility, then whose responsibility is it to teach us that? Because they sure don't talk about that in school. And there are certain things in life that I think are moral that don't have anything to do with politics, that are completely embedded in, if we do have a spirituality, or I think spirituality is also connected to morality. I don't know, to answer your question,
It's a hard one, it really is. I mean, we're talking about social justice, and we think of that as a church activity, but we also think of it as government's purview. How do you split that hair?
well, I think, you know, social justice and, well, it used to be called welfare. Social services help. Didn't used to be connected with the government at all.
It was the church.
It was the church's response. In fact, it's still the church's responsibility. It's a mandate on believers of a spiritual practice. I don't care what it is. There's something in each major religion that teaches the adherents of that religion that you must take care of your fellow brethren. Period.
Let me just stop you right there. I would agree that what you're saying to a point. However, in my opinion and my experience, I believe that government has a responsibility to its citizens. I believe that government and our tax money should be going to our schools, should be going to social services for people who cannot, for whatever reason, disability, brain injury, cannot care for themselves. I really would take offense to knowing that I might have to go to a church to get a social service need met. I really would. But for me, one of the things that I find quite disgusting is the idea that in order to, if I am homeless, in order to get a meal, I have to put up with a sermon first.
Mm-hmm.
I have to, it's almost as though I am not worthy of care unless I am willing to be prayed over or whatever. So I have a hard time with that. I think there is, that there should be a separation between church and state. I don't think church has any business trying to influence elections, for instance. We've had many times in recent years where priests in the Catholic Church have told people if they don't vote in a certain way, they are damning themselves to hell.
And not only there, it's in the other conservative churches there. I heard it as well.
I just think that is abhorrent.
I agree.
We should not be doing that. Now, do I believe that people in government should have a moral compass, should have some idea of how they steer themselves through life when they're making decisions that will affect everyone? Yes, I think, but do we have that? Not necessarily. You know, and I would say that sometime in the 70s, we, society, a huge explosion of the charismatic movement, people throwing themselves into the living Christ as my Savior, my, whatever. And as a result, I saw people going to the left with that, and I saw people going to the right with that. And those people who went to the right with that really weren't so interested in the message of Christ, which was, obviously, you gather everyone. We are inclusive, not exclusive. You gather everyone to the table. But the people who went to the right were the people who got into the mega churches, the
moral majority.
send me the money, send me the money, honey.
Prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think there needs to be a huge separation of church and government. And I believe that as long as I am paying taxes, my taxes should be going to care for the least among us.
Mhm. Okay, well, somebody might say, as long as I'm paying tithes, my tithes should go to care for the least among us. So, although I agree with you, I would rather see government take that chore on, but Herb, it's your turn.
I'd like to
Yeah.
defer to you.
Okay. Very good at that, Herb. Let's see. I've been so busy listening, I haven't really formulated a thought. I think that if we want to see what happens when church becomes government, we need to look at fundamentalist Islam. The whole idea of Sharia law, the idea that the civil laws are based on the scriptures, and there's no division. There's no civil government and religious government. They are the same, and it can be very successful perhaps in a small venue, but when you try to make it any larger, and especially when you try to make it worldwide, you run into opposition, and there's no way to quiet that opposition. There's no way to force people to agree with your spiritual outlook and behave as you tell them your spiritual outlook says they ought to. So I'm very concerned that church and state remain not only separate, but if possible, as far apart as they can be, because I just don't see any good coming from the combination.
Something happened, and I'm not sure what year it was, but Franklin D. Roosevelt created a social service net for everybody.
Right.
And I think, and I haven't been able to find out any evidence of this, but I think that the government decided to take up making sure that there were none left behind, that everybody had some sort of net to catch them, because the church refused to do it. That's what I think. And in my opinion, I don't even know if the Salvation Army is, even though that slogan, they do the most good, I believe that at least to some extent there's a truth in that. At the time when I converted to become a soldier, I really believed that there was no organization, religious organization, faith-based organization that did as much good as the Salvation Army, and that's why I was most happy to give them my time and talents and money there. But of course now, after we have that, the government taking over, City of Little Falls, for instance, used to be the social services or social welfare giver of money here locally, and I found that in the old city council books down at City Hall. They did before Morrison County took over. And I don't know what was the cause, why that changed, but they used to care for the homeless and the children that needed economic help. That was all in the city before. But I think that the church's failure to support the foreigners, the Levites, the widowers, and the orphans, the church's failure is why government had to take over. And I agree that government should be taking the role of making sure that those that have need, that it's met. But Now, because during the Bush administration, so much of the church was given an opportunity to take on the work of government. You have this, the church is like the intercessor sort of role now, with taking care of people in the United States as well as in foreign nations. You know, I don't know what they're called, but there's nonprofits that help, and they get government funding. Lutheran Social Service is a good example, and there are others,
Yes.
Catholic Charities, to help with governmental type work, needs give out programs, so to speak.
Does the government then get to have any voice in how these funds are administered?
I don't know, I can't answer that, I
You
think
know,
maybe
I
they
have to
do.
think they do.
I think they maybe do, I'm not
Yeah.
sure about that, but I think they do have. But go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to get Herb into the
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
You deferred to everyone, it's now, you're on the spot, Herb. And let me just give you a beginning point, because I know you have so much to tell us. One of the things that I know about you is that you believe that churches should pay taxes. So my question is why you think that, and how does it affect their relationship with the government?
Okay, well, first I'll just state that I'm totally opposed to any involvement of the church and state, but I totally understand that this country, the United States of America, started out with that concept, gave up on that concept, and is now virtually totally bought and paid for by two countries. One is Jewish and the other is Muslim. Saudi Arabia and Israel, or Israel and Saudi Arabia, more consistent. So, should they be separate? Of course, I'd like it to be that way. That is the Constitution. Is it separate? It is not even close. It probably will not be redeemed, certainly in my lifetime, that we will continue to have the commingling of the church and state. The other thing, and you kind of touched on it in your comments, was when Robin says the church, she means one thing. When you say the church, you mean another thing. When I say the church, I mean Satanism, Mormonism, Judaism, Wahhabism, whatever you want to call it, Dominionism, Catholicism, Protestantism. There's a million different churches, not a million. There are many different churches. I can't imagine, for instance, the people in Morrison County or Todd County, where I'm from, would like to live in a government that was mostly influenced by a Muslim church, or mostly influenced by a Jewish church. But right now, we're partially influenced by both. Certainly, if I wanted to run for the legislature, I could say, well, I'm an atheist, vote for me. And I'd be running against, say, somebody that was from here, Grizelka. I'm a Christian, vote for me. The odds are pretty good that he would win, and if we threw a Jew in there or a Muslim in there, I don't think it'd matter, if they ran on that platform. So that underneath the surface, they're mixed and totally mixed.
So you would say that Christianity, or at least the semblance of Christianity, is a political convenience?
I wouldn't say that, no.
Okay, well, I said it.
Yeah, no, it can be viewed that way, but Christianity means so many different things. I mean, there's the Christianity that Retha talks about in terms of the social justice Catholics versus the new dominionists that want to have God's kingdom here on earth, and they are trying to impact our government.
They are impacting.
And Morrison County doing a bang-up job. Some of their representatives are either out of the closet dominionists or at least attend dominionist functions. So it's not an accident, for instance, that the the right-wing anti-Muslim people come to this area to speak.
Mhm.
I mean, those people are not distinct from the dominionists who'd like to see God.
Their version of God's kingdom, yes.
Right. So,
We were talking at lunch, just for a moment about the Illuminati, and it seems to me that whenever there's a chance to grab at some power, it has to come packaged in symbols and some kind of a spiritual platform, so that you can, I don't know, signal to one another under the table, so you can find a way to communicate on a nonverbal level or on a cloaked verbal level in order to communicate your willingness to conspire. So you didn't get to the part about taxes though, Herb.
okay. From my perspective, totally disregard all differential treatment of all religious persons. They should pay taxes on their property. They should pay taxes on their income. They should have to open their books to audits, etc. We had $1 trillion outfit, the Catholic Church, who has compartmentalized so secretly that now a little segment of them in St. Paul or St. Cloud or wherever went on, these dioceses they call them, which is a religious creation, are saying, oh, we're bankrupt, so we can't pay for the damage that we've done, when they're bankrupt because we sent the money over here. Of course we're bankrupt.
So they personally, in their own little tiny dominion, are bankrupt.
The money that we saved in this account is very little. The money that we sent to Rome or wherever we send it, I'm assuming Rome is where the Catholics send it, but they might not, I don't know.
I don't know either.
They might send it to the Bundesbank in Germany, for all I know, who does their banking, but there is actually a Vatican bank.
Yeah, I believe there is.
But no, I cannot, for the life of me, understand how we got there, even though I did read a lot of the history of how we got to the church's tax exemptions, etc. I'm 100% opposed to it. Obviously, everybody here in Morrison-Todd County would be 100% opposed to it if it was a dominated Muslim government. But it's not a dominated Muslim government. It's a dominated Christian, Judeo-Christian, Jewish.
So it's okay.
So, 100%.
I agree that churches should pay taxes. Ministers should pay tax on their retirement and their salaries just like anybody else. If that tax exemption status was taken away, there'd be absolutely nothing to prevent most pastors and priests, nuns and all of them, speaking out against war. And if I had to air one beef I have with the church besides sexism and the squashing of women's rights and the elimination of the possibility of women being in ministry in so many of the churches, it is the beef that world peace and the quest and the conquering of peace is never discussed in the Christian church. Catholics,
So you're saying
Any
that
of
you're saying if churches had to pay taxes, they would be forced to take a.
no, they wouldn't be forced, but they'd be able to talk more freely about what's wrong with our government and why we continue to
They could do
do.
that from both sides of the table. That's the problem, Rob. You could have some churches saying, okay, now we've got the chance to really preach social justice, because we're part of the big team now. We're paying taxes like everyone else, but you've got people on the other side of the table saying, now we can preach whatever the alt-right gospel is, because we're paying those taxes too. So then you've got people saying, we can preach that white people are superior.
Well, let them.
Yeah, they
Let
can
them,
now.
you know, they can now. That's a free speech issue. You know, and if they had a big boon to their church and a lot of people joined up, hoo-ha for them. But I think we have the world crisis problems that we have and perpetual war specifically because the Christian church and Jewish synagogues and Jewish rabbis, the clergy itself, across the board in all these different denominations are not at all speaking against war. Specifically, United States perpetual war, endless war.
I don't think that paying taxes is gonna change that. I don't see how it could.
Maybe it wouldn't, but it would allow them to do that without losing their tax exemption.
Okay, they could do that without losing their tax exemption, that's true, but they might lose their whole congregation.
Yeah, they probably would.
Let me just interject here
Yes.
that there is no limit that is enforced on the churches right now because of their tax exemption. They do not lose their tax exemption when they preach from the pulpit and say, vote for this pro-life candidate, because if you vote for the pro-choice one, you're going to hell. Nobody that I know of thinks that any one of them is in danger of losing their tax exemption. They do it openly in Stearns County, we know that for sure. I don't know anything about any of the others, but the reality is that the tax exemption is a perk that they have and that they're not going to lose, either through Congress voting to end it or through violating the law. It's
There's just no downside.
there is no downside, and there is almost no chance of reform. And I'm not a revolutionary, but if there was a revolution and we came up with a new constitution, we could be a lot more clear about what the separation of church and state should be. But right now, we're not very clear.
What, maybe, okay, go ahead.
Well, okay. What I'm hearing in my mind isn't really the problem. The problem, and we spoke about it a little bit at lunch, and that is that we need to be divesting, okay? And what many of the churches, many of the corporations, all the people who are making money, they are invested in arms, in weapons.
Yeah.
The United States of America sends out, and makes and distributes more weapons than anyone.
It's what
Maybe
fuels our
Israel
economy.
does as well. But that is the basis of our economy, correct? Okay, so you have, how do you then try to get people to talk about peace? Or, how do you stop endless war? You have to get people to divest from the arms industry. I mean, we have to. We absolutely have to. And I don't know how we can do that, but I do know that when we talk about divesting from Israel, we are then, because we don't want to see the Palestinians decimated, we are then accused of being anti-Semites.
Anti-Semitic, yeah.
And we're not. What I am is I am pro-peace. Let's stop killing each other, people.
Yeah, let's just start there.
Let's just stop killing each other. And I always go back to South Africa. It worked in South Africa. It can work in other areas of the world.
I believe that, I agree
If we
with you.
do it.
If we do it.
Yeah.
But then there is at least the illusion that when you talk about Israel, you're talking about both a government and a religion. And
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it's crazy.
No, it's
So-
not. If you're talking about the United States, you're talking about both the government and Christianity.
I suppose
You're
that's
talking
true.
about Israel, you're talking about Judaism.
But
And
then,
you're talking about Saudi Arabia, you're talking about Islam. It's not crazy. I mean, it's a reality.
it's a reality, but I think that the situation in Israel is a little different because they are not, how can I say this? In the question of sort of trying to eliminate the Palestinians, it's not just so that they can have back the territory that the Palestinians are now occupying. Part of it is that we're Jews and you're not, and that's why.
Well,
and you're essentially Muslims.
that's why we killed the Native Americans, because we were Christians and God was on our side and they were savages, so we didn't honor their religious beliefs.
And we wanted their land just as Israel wants the Palestinian holders. Very, very true, very true.
I brought this up at lunch. I'm just going to read the highlighted parts here. I found this, and actually a friend sent me this because she knew we were going to be doing a new show on church and state and politics and so on. This is from the Sojourner site, which is a Lutheran organization. It's a wonderful site, in my opinion. Social justice is a Christian tradition, not a liberal agenda. And I'm skipping around here, but many Christians are wary of participating in social justice because of a deep-rooted fear of being labeled liberal, progressive, or secular. They don't want to be associated with secular movements that are uncomfortable delving into issues that go beyond their cultural comfort zones. So saying Black Lives Matter and participating in a movement seeking justice, positive reform, and empowerment is one of the most Christ-like things we can do. I agree with that 100%. Jesus wasn't just preaching a universal salvation message for the world, but he was also addressing specific political, social, and racial issues. He was helping those who were being abused, violated, and oppressed. Involving ourselves within these issues, serving those who need justice, is an example of following Jesus that today's Christians must adhere to, because throughout the world there are millions of people who are suffering. But many Christians remain simply apathetic, ignorant, or refuse to admit any problems exist. They're uncomfortable facing the complex and controversial issues surrounding race, ethnicity, history, and culture. Participating in social justice is a Christian tradition inspired by Jesus, not liberal causes, populist agenda, media platforms, lawmakers, or mainstream fads. It's a deeply spiritual practice. By acknowledging and actively participating in the Black Lives Matter movement, addressing racism, immigration, gender equality, and a litany of other issues, you are following in the steps of Jesus. It's not a matter of pitting social causes against the gospel message of Christ. It's a matter of realizing that these causes are actually an important part of the gospel message. For instance, you talk about your history with the Catholic Church. There's this organization called the Catholic Workers, and I think they are headquartered in Iowa, Des Moines, I think. That group actually purposely commits violations of the law to point out the dangers of nuclear power, and that's one of the big ones they go after, and other things. And they put themselves on the line. They purposely get arrested on a regular basis because of their faith. This is a little sidetracking, but the nuns, a couple of years ago, there was this thing called the Nuns on the Bus. Yeah. And it was around that time, or right after that time, that the men in the Catholic Church that are in leadership positions, the cardinals and the different ones, cracked down on the sisters' political movements that they were involved in. And that has made a difference, I think, in what they can do, or have decided to do. Instead of rocking the boat so much, I think they're just kind of oaring along peacefully with the rest of the church, so they don't get booted out or harassed anymore by the men in the clergy.
Listening to you talk about how social justice is a purely Christian purview. I don't think so. The person who wrote this talked about Jesus being the one who established justice, was against racism, was against, I'm sorry, I don't have it off the top of my head. But I'm not finding that to be true. I mean, that's not my experience. My experience in the biblical story is that Jesus spoke to whoever was there when he took an ocean. And if you got to him and you were sick, he'd heal you. But he didn't ask for your credentials. He didn't even ask for your name. He just gave what he had to whoever was there when he was prepared to give it. I don't find a place where he was anti-racist. As a matter of fact, at a couple of points, he was very much a Semite and not at all interested um, in hearing the argument to the contrary of that.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please do.
The problem that I think we have in discussing this church and state and whatever religion we're going to talk about is that we're building the whole argument on something that is so mushy.
I was just saying.
There is no proof that Santa Claus actually exists. Okay? The earliest evidence for Santa Claus having existed is a story told by a person generations later. That story was then heard by another person who wrote it down. And that was generations after the supposed existence of the person called Jesus Christ. The biblical Jesus did not exist in anything other than a creation of the mind. And that is the problem in trying to argue a issue, because what we're dealing with is something that is not substantive and not factual. And when you begin to argue based on, I believe this and you believe that, and my belief in Joseph Smith's Angel Moroni is as valid as your belief in Mary's virgin birth. When those two crazy ideas come together, you don't end up with a less crazy idea. You just end up with saying, well, I'll ignore your crazy idea, you ignore mine, let's just argue that there really is something there. And when they get together, they believe that they are the church and they deserve a tax exemption. And I have to make a confession. I am a licensed minister as well, from the same church as Robin.
Why did you decide to do that? I didn't mean to interrupt you, sorry.
That's right. Well, I'll tell you why I decided to do it. I thought that there was enough people opposed to the legislation to enable gay marriage that they would make some limitations on the rights of gays to marry.
Mm-hmm.
And so my thought was that I was going to get licensed as a minister, and I would be the official Todd County gay marriage minister. Because my belief,
I applaud that, that's wonderful.
my belief and my involvement in the whole gay issue is pretty tangential, but I do know a trans person who wanted to get married. And I thought to myself, they will be able to legally marry if I am a minister. And so I became the minister for the same small fee that you did. And I am committed to the same United States Constitution. And contrary to some people's beliefs, you can be good without God.
Absolutely.
You know, I am a social justice non-believer. As social justice as any non-believer you know, because most of you don't know any non-believers. The truth of the matter is, you do know many non-believers.
Yeah.
They're cowards and they're liars, and many of them go to church because the same reason that many people buy Harley Davidsons instead of Hondas. They're afraid to be an outsider. They want to be part of the group, and I fully support their right to belong to the religion. But if they would just acknowledge that the whole God concept is a creation of man's intellect. And we know when it started. I mean, we've got historical data that in the early Stone Age, they did not verbalize the word God. You know, we know when the earliest printings of the words Jesus Christ of Nazareth were. You know, that we have. But we know that the whole creation story occurred after creation. I mean, nobody thinks that a document is there telling us about the Garden of Eden based on somebody who witnessed the Garden of Eden. It's based on somebody who came millions of years after the supposed Garden of Eden. Anyway, I couldn't sit here without injecting this whole thing that here we are trying to have a rational argument, which requires evidence and proof, about an irrational topic, which requires faith. And we just need to acknowledge that that can happen. I mean, it's sophistry, they call it, I think, where you take your education and apply it to verbosity, and you say many things in nice phrases about things that you can't prove. Why? Because I believe that Joseph Moroni did look into the hat, and he did translate the gold tablets. And he got those gold tablets from the angel. As much as I believe that Moses went up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments.
You know, sometimes I think when I'm driving around on the streets, I'm putting a whole lot of faith in everybody else who's out there in the car.
Yes.
And although that's I don't mean to minimize religious faith, but it still
I
comes
do.
down. I know, but it still comes down to faith and having the idea that there's something we all kind of agree to. We agree to obey the traffic laws and not cut each other off or run stop signs, and we agree not to rob and murder and kidnap people. So we.
Agree to lie to ourselves about the existence of a higher power because we don't understand.
Well, you don't have to understand to believe.
Pardon?
You don't have to understand.
No, in fact, it helps a lot. The less you understand, the more you believe. I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
if you look at climate change, the people in Todd and Morrison County will be certain to tell you that this is probably a hoax. And it's certainly not as bad as I think it is. I think it's the catastrophe of my
I do
lifetime,
too.
worse than an atomic bomb.
Yeah.
And they would say that everything's under control, God's got a plan.
Yeah, and not only that, but our dear leaders are doing everything in the right way to bring about the right result. And on that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time. My, that was a fast hour.
It was
I want to
fun.
thank you, Herb Davis and Retha Dooley. Robin, as always.
And we'll be back with another episode of this topic.
Okay,
The
All
month
right.
following when this airs, we're gonna continue our discussion for another hour, and that one will air following this one. So I wanna suggest that we start with the topic of, so
Wrap it up.
why is it,
Wrap it. We're done.
okay,
thank you so much. Bye.